Okay, so, hi, I'm Barb Stengel, and I am delighted to be here as a chair and discussant for the work of Chappelle Monique Laborde.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And Elena Marie McDonald Thompson.
I don't know why my whole name is there.
I don't either, but we'll take it. And they both have something to say about the day.
Oh yes, we want to. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Happy International Women's Day.
I think that's a great way to get started. So these are works in progress sessions. Elena's paper is a little more finished than Chappelle's is, but they both have, my reading of them is they both have a lot going on, and one of the things we're going to do is help them figure out what it is that they do have going on and can accomplish in one paper or more than one paper. That's what I hope we can do for them. So I've invited them to talk about two things. One is to say, what's the itch they're trying to scratch? They have a perception about something in the world, and this is, my sort of pragmatism coming out, but you don't think until you're prompted to think, and they're thinking now. So something is pushing them to think. What is that thing as far as they can specify it right now? And then, what are they doing about it? How does that work? And to the extent they can summarize what's in the papers in front of them. We're not going to read papers because I don't think that'll get us anywhere right now. So, Elena, why don't you go, and then we'll go to Chappelle, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure.
You're saying myself included. Okay, so if there's something like, what do you mean by that? I haven't heard that. Let's hear from Chappelle.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So, yes, my paper is doing a lot. So, in answering the question about what's the itch I'm trying to scratch, well, I want to talk about the inspiration behind my project. It was inspired from my childhood visits and my immersions with visiting my uncle, Abdul, as a U.S. Black political prisoner. That directly impacted my education and becoming a critical thinker and the type of educator I am today. It also, this project is also inspired presently by my experience working in a community of multilingually diverse students, consistently positioning myself to lower the affective filter. So in the language learning setting, we want to make sure that there is this sense of trust and respect in the community when you're working with diverse students. So this project talks about that through U.S. Black political prisoners as a whole. It's something that people don't normally look at as a site for educators. We don't look at them as a model or exemplar. That's what I'm arguing as educators, and I want to give light to that. So in my project, I talk about how looking at U.S. Black political prisoners, it creates an aesthetic experience where the person who witnessed them in their full humanness and understands them as people who are trying to enact change and did these daily, everyday, yet radical things that were grounded in community, they found themselves victim to the carceral system. And I wanted us to really feel a sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Like we can see ourselves in them.
Solidarity.
Yes, solidarity, or that there is no division between, even though there's prison walls, there is no real wall of division between myself and a political prisoner, because I had the experience of visiting my uncle, because I had that knowledge of him, being an active community member with the breakfast programs, the safety patrol of people in the community when there was police brutality in our neighborhood and things like that, and how with the theme of the conference, the misinformation and the intentional painting of people who were community activists as criminals, the micro surveillance, the hyper surveillance, the policing of these peoples, and the disruption of what they were trying to do to organize and bring about community change. This has led to a generational disruption of who these people were as human beings, as people, as fathers, as sons as uncles and things like that, and to now they're criminalized, you know, and how there's a whole structural operation that was intentionally built to uphold this idea that there is space between myself and this person. So that's really what I was trying to do, is bring some beauty and some humanness to the stories, because I believe in elevating the voices and the stories of these people. We remember the work that they've done, and that we too can easily, when committed to true education and radical community building, we too can find ourselves victims of carceral systems. Of course, if you're a person of color, if you have a certain orientation around gender and sex, you may find yourself quickly inching towards an inmate, being an inmate. However, in growing up in the work, I've witnessed a lot of people of privileged backgrounds who are so committed to the community building and the work, you know, the Weather Underground, and they found themselves, a lot of white people who found themselves being, what do you call it, kind of like, no, but like they receive harsher sentences because they're white and they're not from this background, and you know, so they were now given like, yeah, they should know better, they should have performed in a way that was acceptable, and this was really dangerous. So I'm also trying to pull out this theme of danger and what it looks like to be a dangerous person, and how that whole thing created like this idea of painting political prisoners as dangerous people, how that really impacts the public's mind and how that impacts history. Because to this day, I purposely dress today like a Black Panther, and I'm making sure to smile, I'm making sure to be serious, I'm making sure to also affirm this work, because it has a history of, this uniform has a history of being taken seriously, you know, being taken as a person that's to be respected and treated with dignity because of that history of Black Panthers. And then also, you know, as an homage to all the work that they've done in education. The breakfast program, sorry, I'm getting a little off the paper, but the breakfast program that we have in New York City public schools was directly from the Panthers organizing to feed hungry Black and brown children, you know, and it was co-opted. And that whole history is forgotten. I've talked to so many people who did not know the Black Panthers started that whole program. Testing, a lot of the testing that's done in urban communities has been because Black Panthers went out and organized and surveyed the community to see what they needed, what kind of testing, the sickle cell and things like that. So a lot of programs that they started was kind of erased by the government, and that impacts history, and that is, you know, along the lines of disinformation, misinformation, and it's very intentional. So I wanted to come today and be intentional in how I appeared, and also about what I'm talking about as a legitimate, you know, form of philosophy, and understanding that I am positioning these people as educators, I'm positioning these people as philosophy, and that is legitimate enough because of all the structures that obscured and, you know, prevented them from being legitimized in other ways. So I'm here to bring voice to that because I've done whatever I had to do to get through those hoops. And now that I've gotten through those hoops, I'm trying to bring these people forward today. And I'm still working on the paper, but that's generally the gist, is that I'm trying to look into the aesthetic of looking at a U.S. Black political prisoner and seeing them as an educator and seeing them as somebody just like us.
Okay, again, questions for clarification.
I have more questions for later, like
Yeah.
conceptual questions. I just am kind of curious of how you're thinking about aesthetic. So if you could talk.
When you say a Black aesthetic.
Okay, yes. So I have wrote in my paper, in my paper, I talked on it a little bit. It's a philosophical theory that started in the 60s, where that Black people need to have a Black framework. We can't have, you know, people from other communities and cultures consistently identify and name and define what it is that we're experiencing or what we create. So self-determination is a big theme. And even today with the Black feminist epistemological framework, it's still struggling in philosophy and sociology and things like that. So that's pretty much the Black aesthetic, is just saying that we need people who can create these value judgments on the Black experience. And to this day, you know, we still don't have enough people that are in these spaces to do such. And particularly with that Black aesthetic, I'm trying to say that when we bear witness to actually seeing humanity and people who have been framed as something other than, we will have an educating experience where we begin to unlearn and relearn certain things that we've been socially conditioned to believe. Like, anybody who didn't know anything about Black Panthers or U.S. Black political, some people didn't even know there was political prisoners in the United States. So I think that when we learn these stories, when we just look at people and learn stories and we hear their stories, there's a certain experience, like when we see a work of art, when we see the things that these people have had to go through and defeat, or even succumb to. A lot of people have died in prison. Something begins to happen in us when we bear witness to the fact that these human beings are real. They were people who had families. They were people who worked very hard and committed themselves to their communities. And this is the reality they had to live. And then if we start to explore, sorry, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but when we start to explore the ways that even when they were placed within prison walls, they still were committed to community. They still are committed to revolution. They're still committed to education. They find themselves mentors and teachers to young Black men or young men in the same carceral system, and they try to, you know, teach them. So that's what I'm looking at, like the person who's bearing witness and what happens with them when they look at this person as a full human being and not less than. I hope that was clear.
Okay, so here's what I want to do, because here's how I feel about both of these projects right now, and this is, you know, this is coming from me, but they can put me in charge here, so I want you to think about what is the purpose of theories of oppression, various theories of why do we theorize oppression? Because there's an experience of oppression. And what's missing in both of these projects is a rich enough concretization of the experience of oppression. And so, as a for instance, Chappelle, and I'll start with Chappelle first. You talk about US Black political prisoners. It's not transparent to, especially white folks, but it's not transparent exactly who you're talking about. And when you mention your Uncle Abdul, all kinds of things start to fall into place. So one of the things that I want to ask you to do is not talk theory at all, not try to explain anything. Tell us a couple of concrete stories. Tell us a couple of examples. Tell us about visiting your uncle. Tell us about when you encountered the story of a particular Black Panther or something like that, as a young person, or as, you know, could have been today years old that you learned that. But very concretely, what is the reality of the thing that you're trying to theorize? Because, I mean, I hear you sort of taking the idea of prisoner and turning it on its head and positioning prisoners as the best educators we could have of a certain kind of Black aesthetic or Black experience. You're doing something like that, but I don't know exactly, because I don't have the access to the experience that you're talking about. So what I would like you to do right now is tell us something, if you can, about, you know, when you realize, shit, my uncle's in prison. Maybe you didn't say that, but, you know, when did you realize that, and when did you go there, and what did you know about why he was there? And was there a sense of, okay, I did do something stupid, or was there more a sense of, no, you're being picked up because you are a threat to a dominant culture. What's that about? Because then I want the rest of you to listen to this, and I want us to theorize without Butler, without Fanon, without Arendt.
Yeah.
Theorize without any of that. And then, yeah, we can paste them on if we need them for the, for the legitimacy. But what is going on when a kid goes to visit their uncle in prison?
Yes. Okay. Wow, one spot. So my great grandmother, who I've talked about at length and I can talk about forever, my great grandmother, who recently transitioned in 2021, she raised me. I tell everyone that. So my grandma Bay, I was raised by her. We were 68 years apart, I believe, and her son, who would have been my grandfather's brother, was incarcerated because of his political identity he died in prison, and he was there for 34 years. So as a kid, I visited my uncle all the time, like twice a month sometimes. So I grew up literally hopping around different prisons as a child, not even realizing what prison meant, because my grandmother, as a maternal figure, Black woman, and that's why I'm so passionate about Black grandmothers and keeping a family unit together and community. She was very adamant about nothing getting in between family from my uncle, because that sense of humanity, I guess she knew that he couldn't lose that. And my uncle had his religion, he was Muslim, and there was things he identified strongly with the faith, and that kept him grounded. But I also think those family visits, you can't have more than an X amount of visits. They make it very hard. But I had no clue about this until I became older, and I took on the role of now taking my little cousins to visit Uncle Abdul. I was always the person that came with my grandmother, came with an uncle or something like that, and I really was detached from the responsibility and the posture of like getting through a correctional facility. I was just a kid, so when I would see my uncle, he never was upset. He was never upset, he never yelled, he always wanted to hear about school. Anything they had to talk about that was grown, he would send me to go put money in the vending machine to get popcorn. Or I found this out later. I didn't know at the time as a kid, but I would have these coins, because you gotta get all these quarters. You can't take anything. I always remember you couldn't take anything with us in the visiting room, but it would be cold sometimes, but you can't even take your sweater. That was hard as a kid, but my uncle encouraged me to run back and forth to go put stuff and get popcorn, go get chips. Oh, could you go warm this up for me, my sweet niece, in the microwave or things like that. He was so soft-spoken, he was so loving, and I'm not making this up. I wrote before when he passed, I have never heard him raise his voice my whole life, and he passed in 2016. I never heard him raise his voice, and that was so unique to me as a kid, because he was so tall. He was like 6'3", and he was a big Black man. We could be real here, right? So I grew up in an urban community, so it was very I will never forget the way he navigated and the way other people moved and listened to him, and he commanded attention without raising his voice, without being violent, without going back and forth too much. That was very that left an impression on me forever. That this is a representation of Black manhood that isn't like what I see in media. And I'm seeing this every week, every month, or something like that. So long story short, as a kid, it never really hit me that my uncle was in prison and that he could be in a struggle. I used to have questions like why he can't come home, but it never hit me because he never emanated that he was struggling. He never emanated that he's in pain. He never, I never even understood what prison was.
He didn't act like a prisoner.
He didn't act like a prisoner, but how does a prisoner act?
Okay, now I want you to stop, and I want you to ask her questions about this that would help to theorize what is it that Chappelle has to write. And it may not show up in the paper, but it's part of getting you to a place where this paper can make some sense. What questions do you have now about prisoners, about prison, about Uncle Abdul, about Chappelle visiting? Go.
Yeah, I think that, and Thank you, Barbara, for setting up that framing, and thank you, Chappelle, for sharing.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. My question is that I'm curious to hear a little bit more because it almost feels like something you said came out in your story about like you told Addison that self-determination is big for black aesthetics, right? And it seemed like your uncle Abdul was giving you a story of black manhood that the society was not. And so I'm wondering, and so my question is that, like, what would it mean to look to your uncle Abdul as a source of theory? That's like my question. Like, what would it mean to look at him as the source of theory for your reader? Because when you gave that story to me, I suddenly saw an educator, I saw a role model, I saw a guide, I saw everything that you were telling me that you wanted your paper to accomplish, to be honest.
Yeah. And just really quickly, like
Sure.
somebody else can add, but I feel for my uncle. He was one of my key educators because he used to another concrete. So he would clip newspapers like about jobs, opportunities, anything that would advance me.
Wow.
He would just always send that in his letters. He wrote me letters. He was very big on writing letters, and I'm his great niece. So I just want to position that as an important fact because he has other family members and he did that for all of us.
Wow.
You know, he did all of that. So as an educator, I always think about how my uncle always kept that close relationship and he always thought about your future. So he would always ask me questions about school. Always think, well, what do you want to be, Chappelle, when you grow up? What do you want to be? What do you want to be? He signed me up for a book club from prison. We were part of African American Expressions. So everything that I am today, I really attribute to my uncle Abdul as the paternal person that I was very close to, and my grandma Bay. So to answer that, like I see him as, that's why I'm seeing him as like an educator who's had a lot of themes on inheritance, like not just the self, but like, you know, no matter where you are, you know, just determining the possibility of the future and your descendants. Like he always left me with a rich legacy as a kid with education.
Well, I feel like you maybe just answered the question that I was thinking about,
Oh, okay.
which is with maybe a slightly different approach, but you said that you wanted to talk about a black aesthetic. And when you were describing your Uncle Abdul, you talked about his body, his voice, and then in the examples you've given now, like I see you building your own definition of what a black aesthetic is through your experiences with your uncle. And so I guess my question is just like, what is that aesthetic? If you were to like sort of take each of those pieces and each of those parts, how would you name? Maybe that's not something to like right this second.
But it's a question that has to be answered.
Yeah.
Not necessarily right this minute.
Yeah, and I think you could also like break it down into like the things you were already doing now, which is like what did he teach you and how did he teach you and why did the way that he taught you matter? Right? What's distinctive about that kind of teaching that you got from him?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I love hearing you talk, and it's interesting because the thesis presentation Chappelle gave this, it's so foundational on stories, a specific story, and it was just beautiful to see that come alive for your thesis. So this story is likewise beautiful, and I'm interested because you're describing a man that I can see him just as easily in the living room as I can in a prison context. So because he's of how he's the relational capacity hasn't changed at all. It maybe even has grown stronger. But then you're talking about political prison, and I'm really interested in that term. I mean, it's like a strong term. And I think you're right. I don't think people realize that there's political prisoners in this country. They're like, oh, no, now maybe in Russia, that's a political prisoner. But I'm wondering, first of all, just practically speaking, in your story, your experience, how does that come through? What do you see? What did you experience in terms of that whole concept?
Now, before Chappelle answers, I want to remind you that we're playing a game here, and the game is philosophy, okay? So we have to We can tell stories till the cows come home, but those stories are in the service of something.
Yeah.
And you can't not tell the stories. That's what I'm trying to say to both of these folks, that you've got to start and do the work with the stories, really concretize them. What happens to them in terms of the finished product of the paper? I don't know. Some of it might disappear. It might get distilled. It might turn into a different paper that what you're trying to do. But remember that you're using words here, terminology that has meaning in the world. Prison, prisoner. When you say that in the piece that you wrote, you say, how does that make you feel when you hear prisoner? So prison, one of the things you've got to do is a bit of a language analysis on the idea of prison, and carceral systems, because this is language that you're using as well. So what do we typically think of? What is a prison? What is a prisoner? What is a carceral system? Go ahead, Ben.
And can I also add that you're also a child visiting a prison, which I think is really significant.
Yes.
Like, I think it's
Yes.
really important that you keep saying, I didn't know what I was doing, because you said, I didn't know what I was seeing, like which carceral institution I was in. And one kind of texture, if I could add, which will add a bit of friction, is you were saying that he didn't show you that he was struggling. And it's like, that seems like a political act, maybe? I don't know. Like, that invited some texture to me, which is like, there was an acknowledgement of your childhood in that week. I don't know. But like, there's some texture there that I felt like could be unpacked a bit more.
But I still want to ask, so you got prison, you got prisoners, you got carceral system. You didn't have that miseducation, and I do want to use this term miseducation here to invite you to say, this is the way many people, not everybody, not you, have been educated about political prisoners. And then there is this counter narrative based in real experience that you want to look at, and one of the things you have to take up, and I still don't know the answer to this, what was Abdul's crime? Was it truly political, or was it the sort of manufactured drug use, that kind of thing? Like, who counts as a political prisoner and who's not a political prisoner? We could make an argument that every single black person jailed for marijuana use is a political prisoner. I mean, you could make, I don't think that's the argument you're making.
No, yeah.
So, but you need to do it.
His also basically, yeah. So I would have to say his real crime, and I was going to do that in the paper.
Yeah.
He was in prison for murdering a police officer in self-defense. My uncle was on the Daily News front page with a bandage on his head. He got shot. And because of his political identity and the Black Panthers with self-defense, so he, fought back because they were shooting at him. So he, shot back, and unfortunately, the police officer passed away. And also at the time, he was also connected with Assata Shakur, who is still to this day wanted, and so that's why his sentencing was so harsh. So he was up for parole, and they kind of like my uncle died from medical homicide in the prison. So they neglected him, and he died from sepsis. And it could have been easily fixed, but leading up to his death, there was a lot of things done to him because he was being released. He worked really hard on his campaign and things like that, and he served his time. He served over his time. But they just really didn't want him to leave, and that's why he was a political prisoner through and through, because from his identity and self-defense politics, like if the police are beating on my community and nobody wants to do anything about it, then we have to do something about it. Like, we cannot continuously be slaughtered and, policed in this way. So they took up arms and they did the policing of the community, and that identity and that political affiliation really led into this hyper-surveillance. It led into counter-intelligence. It led into all these things to where now when the police engaged in aggressive acts with him and they knew he would respond in this way, he ended up in the carceral system for that amount of time. And when it was time for him to go, like I said, they were not trying to let him go because of his effect on the community as an educator.
Now, I want to shift over here,
Yes.
but let me just say this. Do you know Danielle Allen's book about her cousin?
Yeah.
I think you should find it and read it, because
It's a-
Danielle Allen is a political theorist at Harvard. She's still at Harvard, I think.
Yep.
Who has written a number of great books, but her most recent project, I think it's the most recent, is about her cousin who was a drug dealer, and he's imprisoned, and I think it's a similar kind of narrative, and I think it might help you to figure out how do you want to stay with this story, which is clearly a powerful story in a lot of ways. You don't want to generalize it. See, that's the problem that you're going to have when you write about this, because the audiences that you're going to write for are not going to understand any of the stuff that you just shared with us. So you really need to start writing these, this part talking, you can ignore me, free advice, but start writing these little one-pagers about visits to Uncle Abdul. I mean, he is all by himself a counter-narrative to what prison and prisoner and whatever means. And he's in prison and imprisoned. What's the sort of existential reality of that? You didn't know it, you do understand it now. And so you can fight the unfairness of it, but you didn't, as a kid, what you knew is that he couldn't come home.
Yeah.
And that didn't seem right to you, but you didn't have a bigger apparatus to hang
Right.
that
And I talk about that in my body knowledge. That's
Yes.
what I'm getting into.
Yes.
I always felt something was wrong when I physically was moving further away from him. Like when it was time to go home as a kid, when I would go home and see my other uncles, and I could always have access to them, but this uncle.
Okay, so when as you tell this story to yourself, you're naming some of these things, and then you're looking for parallels in other circumstances of imprisonment and frankly in schooling. I mean, there are going to be all kinds of parallels that are going to emerge, I think, for you. But I really want to urge you to stay back. Go ahead.
I know we're going to switch to Elena, and I see a lot of really amazing connections between the two pieces that you're working from, so I'm excited to hear that space as well. Thank you, Chappelle, for everything you've shared. I think in a lot of philosophy conversations, it's not very common, particularly for folks in more privileged positions, to share stories or have to share certain vulnerability. So I guess I just wanted to thank you for that. And I really appreciate, I think there's a very strong philosophical claim here with your point that Black political prisoners are educators, are philosophers. And like the Philosophy of Education Society and philosophers and educators love to cite prison novels. They love to cite Malcolm X, we love to cite MLK, but we don't actually hold them in the way that I think your work is trying to position in this humanizing way of like, these people and histories and aesthetics are educators, are philosophers in their own right, not just like citations to be added to your paper about white ignorance or something. I mean, that's an important concept, but just saying. So I think it's a really strong story in and of itself, and then also very strong salient.
And also, you now have a half a dozen readers, so that if you were to write something, you could email it to somebody and they can give you some, okay, here's what I'm seeing in this. But I think that's where you are right now, and it would be premature to jump into artificial theory that won't convey the strength of what you're talking about. Do you want to say something important to her, or can we move on?
We
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. What's your name?
Tim.
Tim, I knew that. Okay.
Hi.
Tim.
Thank you.
All right, so same thing over here. I don't want you to talk about any theorists. I want you to talk about gay people. I want you to talk about what it was like to be gay in 1950, and then what it was like to be gay in 1960 and 1970 and 1980 and 1990, and you probably don't know all this, but what do you speculate? I mean, let's talk about popular media, let's talk about images in movies, like because you're making a claim, and the claim is that popular thinking has changed about queer people. Okay, so what can you, I mean, you only really have to go back to your own life, but how far back can you go?
Well, I mean, my interest started with the activist group ACT UP, which they were active in the 80s, like after the AIDS epidemic. I watched a documentary on it that was really moving and like encouraged me to like read more about it. And you know, in the 80s, the AIDS epidemic primarily was, you know, it was gay men and bisexual men who were affected by it, and they were pretty much neglected. Like there was no immediate like attention given. It took like several years for there to be any sort of medical movement for you know, like yeah, there was no like priority to help these people who were suffering and dying from AIDS. So
Not just no priority, they were demonized.
yeah, they were demonized. Yeah, like it was
They
seen
deserve
as,
to die.
right, exactly. Like it was like, ah, well, this is what you get for being gay. And I find that like so incredibly dark and just like really depressing. But I feel like, you know, actually, when I first wrote this paper, my vignette, which everyone told me to toss, was that I was at the Pride Parade and there was a PrEP float. And it was like so beautiful too. It had like dancers and everything. And PrEP, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is medicine that gay men take in order to prevent like getting HIV/AIDS. And I thought to myself, like, I just had such a moment because I had just watched the documentary, but I had such a moment where I was like, in the 80s, this was inconceivable that there would be a gigantic float for PrEP, like, being paraded down New York City. So I don't know, I was like kind of struck by, you know, in the course of like 40 decades or something, my math is probably wrong, but yeah, like 40, I don't know, 30 decades or so. What changed? Like, I take that to be some semblance of change. Now, of course, there's critiques about capitalism and like rainbow capitalism, all that, I understand. But I would say that, you know, with all that said, there's some progress being made there, and that's quite phenomenal to me. And that's just one example. I think there's progress made in many different aspects. I mean, we have openly gay Congress people, openly gay, you know, I don't know, just people in your everyday life who are more comfortable being out. Yeah, so that's kind of...
And there's a sense, although there's backlash, but there is a sense that there's, we got to a place of what I would call critical mass, that enough people, I mean, are you looking at the figures of kids who say they're queer?
Yeah.
That's something like 25 to 30% of the population in your age group are saying they're queer. Now that, you know, in my age group, it's 4.5 or something like that. And that includes gay, lesbian, bisexual, whatever else you can put under that umbrella. So absolutely, there is a difference. Now, we're a different age. Do you know the show Real World? Okay, as far as I'm concerned, Real World changed everything. And it changed everything in the second season when they had a gay cast member. And I might be wrong about that, but in my world, and I was working in college campuses and teaching kids and had kids of my own and whatever, Real World just lifted the lid. And the kids, it was mostly kids who started the activism. Now, that's not to say there wasn't activism other times, but, you know, certainly think about Stonewall. And Stonewall was as much frustration as activism. I mean, stand up, that was a different, that was organized in a way that Stonewall wasn't organized. Stonewall had a significant impact. But I think you're onto something. The question is, okay, so why do you have to theorize it? First of all, document it. There is a change. Okay, there is a change. There just freaking is. Why? You're justifying it. The theory, yours isn't a theory of how the hell did this happen. It's a theory that justifies it and explains it. Now, I'm not saying you don't want to do that, but you have to do this other stuff first. Remember always that theory and philosophy come later. These are rational reconstructions of things that are experienced. That's why I want you to go to Uncle Abdul. Because philosophy begins in wonder, as Dewey would say. I wonder what's going on here. Something happened, and what you may need first is some kind of, I don't know, what you need. You have to have an answer for what the interaction is between individual thought and social thought, between social structures and individual logics. You know, your use of logic is really important to me, really interesting to me, because there is not a logic, there are logics of oppression that are at work, and they're not all the same logics. And why is it that the kids in real world could defeat, and it's not to say that I don't know if you ever watched the second season, but it wasn't all smooth. I mean, they had their problems, but they were just normal roommate kinds of problems, and it happened to be linked to the fact that somebody was gay, but you know, they could have been linked to the fact that somebody was leaving their banana peels in the sink or something. That's what made it so believable. It normalized it, literally normalized it. Well, how the heck did that happen?
Yeah.
So I think you're dead right about activism being a piece of what you want to do, and I think you're right to look for ideas about action, Arendt's, Dewey's, others, because action is not unthinking. They all are talking about, you know, ways of being in the world. Arendt and Dewey both have these, but there are other people too. Ways of being in the world, Bourdieu, habitus. We act in certain ways until those ways of acting don't work for us. And then we have to go in, we have to theorize. So how far can you get without asking Butler what she thinks? Butler may be really important here, but maybe not. Or that and this is what I mean about, you might have 6 papers here. You know, there might be a paper about Fanon, there might be a paper about Butler's readability, there might be a paper about whatever. And then it's still unclear, okay, but here we are, that 25% of everybody who's 20 years old is saying they're gay. I mean, what just happened here? And you can, even though you weren't here, you can look back at representations in film or in, I mean, what's the lesbian movie, Desert Storm or Desert Flower or Desert
Rose?
What's her name, Jane? Oh, I mean, every lesbian in the world watched it in 1970 because it was the only...
Desert Hearts. Desert Hearts.
Thank you, Desert Hearts. It wasn't Desert Storm, that was a war. I'm sorry. But I do think, you know, one of the ways of tracking this is through popular media, but also these kinds of polls. Like, I can't even imagine anybody taking a poll like this. How many of you think you're gay?
Yeah.
You know, even Masters and Johnson didn't ask these kinds of questions in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s. I mean, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but not gay, right? I think I'm right about that. So everything you're bringing in, I mean, this is Barb talking, we'll let everybody else talk now, but it's all really important, but you missed a big step. You leaped right over all the good stuff. And if you leap over the good stuff, then what's weird is your paper will write itself if you start with Uncle Abdul. You just start telling this story, and pretty soon there's going to be all these like, okay, and here's a theory of what was going on there, and here's a theory of what was going on there, and it will. You won't be stuck on page 9. You'll be like on page 30 and think, how do I get this done? But you've got to let yourself do that work, that wonder work first, I think. Okay, so questions, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I loved all the sessions I saw today, but this one so far is my favorite. But don't tell anybody else about it. I loved all of their sessions, but this one is my favorite. I like Barb's invitation to kind of theorize ourselves, but with story first, which I think is absolutely essential. Not to bring another theorist, but I'm going to anyway. But it makes me think of The Bridge Called My Back, Radical Women of Color, like that kind of theorizing from story.
Yeah.
And I think it makes a lot of sense in this space. One thing I am kind of curious about how you both might think about now or work with in the future is there will be, of course, as you know, a lot of pushback about stories and narrative from oppressed communities. I use a lot of story and narrative in my work, and almost every time it's like, how is this philosophical? And I'm like, have you read the Odyssey? Have you read a story that we consider one of the most canonical philosophical texts? And then it's frustrating to have to do all the labor to convince everyone that this is philosophical. So I think Barbara's right about the stories. And I'm kind of curious how you might, if there's like a quick reflexive way to push that critique aside so you can actually do the work you're trying to do, because knowing that will flood in.
Just to us?
Oh yeah.
All of us.
To anyone, to everyone.
One thing I will say is that the first draft of the story is not the draft you end up with. And that's, remember that philosophy is a discipline. And I mean that in the sense of there are tools that are always subject to revision. And we've seen a lot of changes in PES. I started coming in 1981, and things have changed dramatically since that time. And if somebody told a story, you'd get laughed out of the ballpark. But what does it take for a story to get to a piece of philosophy? Like, what did it take for the Odyssey to become more than a story told around a fire, and to become that each moment in it is fraught with big questions? And so the answer, it seems to me, is where are the turning points? Where are in Gadamer's terminology, where are the pulled up short moments? The moments when you go, holy shit, I didn't even know he was a prisoner.
Yeah.
But in fact he was. And that's what makes this tremendously educational thing. And it's more educational once you figured out what he was, and what he was up against, and what he was working with. So that's why you got to tell this story to yourself over and over again, and to whoever will listen, so that you can identify those pivot points, those philosophical moments. And that's what I mean about it's. Some people say, oh, well, we're all going to tell stories. Well, no, we're not. Yeah, we are going to tell stories, but that's just the point of entry. It's not the end point. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's making me think about this session I like that we're thinking about the writing and about the theorizing. One of the things I like to think about with the paper is what action verb is it making me do? So for example, and I'll take both of yours and just give you all a spin as to what I think your papers are making me do. Chappelle, your paper is making me see differently. Perception, seeing, like that is the verb that kept coming to my mind. And so I was thinking of the verb. Elena, with yours, and I'm curious if you would agree, when you were talking about the grieving or the loss, right, or the losses experienced, it was, your paper was making me think of vigilance and urgency, because we could lose again. Because we can lose it again. And so I'm wondering if that becomes the hinge or the turn or the hook or because when I thought of your papers with those verbs or those senses, I needed to read them right now. Because one, it would make me change the way I see, which is fundamental, and one, it would make me morally sensitized to something which could be a huge loss again. That would be it. And it's funny because we talk about losses over centuries, but Elena, your loss is from 30 years ago, 20 years ago. There are folks who are still alive who would be in my lifetime, is it going to happen again? And that to me was shocking. you know. So and same for so many members of the black community, right? Like we progress and then you take it away, and then that's why the struggle is constant, right? Like all struggles, right? Like anyway, so that's how I was framing it. Like what verb do you think you're trying to apply to your reader, and what's like happening to them? And when I thought of your two papers like that, I suddenly felt like yes. And Barbara's activity of giving the story made me feel very much there. And you know, it's funny that you mentioned it. I'm in a dissertation proposal seminar with Elena, and one of my comments to Elena literally 2 weeks ago was, I think you do much better without the theorists. I literally said that. Elena, do you remember? Yeah. So like for me, this was super validating that like you were literally like, Elena, you have so much to say before we even need force of non-violence and Fanon, and I couldn't agree more. I think like we have two theorists here. And
Now,
it's
I
like,
do want to say that there is a reason to do these sorts of exegetical pieces about the theorists. As you again, you're too young to remember this, but school figures. If you did ice skating in the Olympics 40 years ago, you didn't just skate the free program. The first thing you had to do was skate figure eights. These were called school figures, and you had to trace them perfectly. And it was just to show that you had command of the skates, and that counted for, I don't know, maybe 20% of your score, and then you went out and did the floaty thing with the music and all that kind of stuff. That's what these pieces are, these exegetical pieces about what does Fanon say about this, what does so-and-so. And you gotta do those. And you gotta do it leading up to your dissertation, and you gotta do it in the early years of your career, because the truth is nobody has anything to say until they're at least 5, maybe 10 years in. Nothing worth talking about anyway. But you can still get accepted in PES and give this thing about what Fanon says about so-and-so. And what it does is it gets you to a place where you actually know what you want to say about something. Because you don't know yet. You haven't been able to put all the pieces together. So I'm not saying don't do those pieces. I think that's important, but don't let those pieces stand in for your philosophical work. That's all I'm saying. Okay, Tim, go.
So I work with a lot of the same people that you talk about in my own project, so that's cool. I'm kind of like, oh, neat.
I got a new friend here.
So I was thinking about your use of, well, and I also look at activism, a different form and reason for the activism, but I guess one question I have for you is like you talk, so just before you even get into Arendt, because I could talk about Arendt all day, but you talk about activism undoing dominant logics, and I feel like I want you to talk more about, maybe you don't have to now, but whatever, but like how, like what is I'm constantly asking myself this, like what is the vehicle that, and like, or the mechanism or whatever, that what is activism actually doing? Because in a certain sense, like activists actually have to like court those who are like embedded in, and if I can, agree with hegemonic logics, right? Like it's like the activist has to convince like people to agree with them, become activists, or
Do they?
well, like
This is a good question. This is a really good question.
yeah. Maybe, yeah. So like because sometimes what I think happens is activists talk to each other, and it's like, I agree with you. It's like, well, of course I agree with you. We're activists together, right? So what I'm wondering about is like, to what extent does it exit that echo chamber? And so again, it's I guess we're here to invoke Arendt. Like Arendt is about, like, for her, the space of the political, right? It's the plurality. So she is saying that what is required. So if you are going to invoke Arendt, I would argue that this is a necessary piece. Is like what is required is this plurality. So that means not the echo chamber, that would be the social realm according to it, right? So how do we get to the space of the political where actually we may not all fully agree, and maybe some of us are more in bed with hegemony than others, but we are like acting and appearing together, right? Like there's a space of appearance that we're creating together. So how do we create that space of appearance? How do we create that activist space that is like a legitimate activist space? It's not just this like echo chambery activist little love fest where we all like each other, but we're not the ones who are trying to convince.
Yeah.
Or we're not, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I love this question, and I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
And this is why I love Maria Lugones, because her concept of complex coalition is exactly what I think Arendt means by plurality, or at least it's like one form of it. And so that's why I think activism could serve as activism, I think, could disrupt these dominant logics, because if the activism is done in a complex coalitional form. Like, that's the only way. And if we're just taking Arendt's concept of action like as it is now, I don't think it can do that work. That's why you sort of have to critique like what Arendt is saying as she's saying it, like as is. I'm not saying that well. And throw in just complicate it a little bit and like talk about power and how that can change the political space. So yeah.
So are you, okay, now this is good. Are you trying to come up with a theory that will tell us how to make change in the future? Or are you trying to explain a change that has already happened?
Yeah.
Because convincing is not something that happens in political ever, to be honest with you, but now we just know it doesn't work. That's the only difference. Nobody ever convinced anybody else. They just horse-traded and did some other kinds of things that made some progress. So what do you think? What are you trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm explaining now is like definitely a different project that I'm working on, like this idea of complex coalition. And I don't.
That's a paper, by the way. The complex coalition and the Arendt plurality. That all by itself. Just
it's like its
That's
own
a paper.
thing.
Yeah.
If I can follow up just on your point, like point of clarification, I don't know, in activist spaces, one of the tasks is that you do go out and you talk to people, and people who are like on the border between like, oh, I don't know, or like, yeah, maybe I do want to join. Like, you talk to them, and if you have like, dialogues that are successful, or like, I don't know, just some sort of dialogue, and they're like, yeah, I want to join, I want to be a part of this, then isn't that a type of convincing?
Well, I don't know. I would say that you're closer when you get to Fanon's representations. People are convinced by stories that they see themselves in. Now, if you say they change their minds as a result of stories, if that's convincing, then okay. I was thinking about convincing being more like, I offer you an argument, that argument makes sense to you, you accept that, and I don't think, I'm not sure that ever works, frankly. I think it's almost always post hoc rationalization. Go ahead.
What I think can happen is, and I was actually involved in this LGBTQ organizing a while ago, long time ago, where we put on these events, and essentially, to spare you the stories, the purpose of the events was ultimately to say to people, this isn't a position you have to accept right now, but this is an argument that you need to participate in. So and therefore we need to participate in it too, right? So we get to appear, you get to appear, and we can debate the terms, and we can debate who exists, like how we need to think about marriage equality or whatever it is. But we actually, and we got criticized a lot from allied folks and LGBTQ folks who were like, no, you need to convince people. And we were sort of like, well, it's pretty tough to convince people. But what you need to convince people of is that the argument needs to exist.
Yeah.
So there was a way in which we were actually, as people say, oh, you're falling short, you're conceding, you're offering too much to the bad guys. But it's like, if you want to be treated as a real human being, then you need to at least argue that the argument itself needs to exist, that the space of appearance needs to exist. So that's what I would say to add to that point. Is I think I have lots of thoughts about convincing, but that's one of them for sure. Is that that the space of argumentation needs to be there, and there's ways to cultivate that. And I would say we were actually successful at some of that.
I just want to throw in what counts as activism. Go ahead, Vic.
Okay,
It's also a good question.
I think based on this example, thank you for sharing the example. I think one of the questions I'm also curious about is what kind of narrative was placed as the narrative of oppression against LGBTQ folks. Like, were they dehumanized? Like, was there humanity what was at stake, or were they affirmed as humans but then viewed as like their deviance made them like was it a question of their mental stability? Like, I think that would also be helpful for me as a reader, because I can't really answer that question. Like, what the narrative of oppression was that was mainstreamed at that time that made them not grievable. Like I understand why they were not grievable because of oppression, but I don't understand the particularity of what the narrative of oppression is. Like, just to give a corollary, like for today, like a lot of the Palestinian activists are saying you're not treating us as human. So I have learned that it's a dehumanization narrative that they are fighting, and they've done a very good job of showing me that it's a dehumanization narrative. I as a reader would really like to know, just as part of your argument, what was the nature of the narrative or narratives that were placed against the community to position me or tell me how I should be viewing that. It's like, I know deviance was one part, but that doesn't seem enough. Anyway, that's just something I was thinking about as a question.
With Vic's question, immediately in my mind, I was like, I think it's a little more complicated to pin it to one argument of if it was dehumanizing or what have you, because of the different identities. Like, there's people who were queer and experienced multiple attacks on their selfhood. I'm thinking of Black trans women back then. What? They were so invisible. They barely have the visibility and the opportunity to navigate today. So I think it's hard to, I don't know how Elena would be able to do this, because queer people's identities are they have so many interlocking identities, and they could experience, I don't know if that's making sense.
You're making complete sense. What I'm going to offer a alternative that I don't know if hegemonic cultures have an intersectional point of view. I think they want to categorize us and keep us in a box. So when you're talking about the complexity of black trans femininity or black trans femme existence, I think the government is no, that's a black woman and trans woman, and we have two particular narratives of violence to impose upon that one person who experiences the multiple narratives. I'm just wondering about that. And you're right, maybe I could be wrong, but I'm just thinking about how the mainstream narrative is trying to, the media industry complex is trying to give me as the public one simple thing to attack this community. Not complicated. Complication is what we're doing, to show people's complexity. But I think that they're trying to simplify actually and say they're bad because of X, and that's all you need to know. That's what I'm wondering about the gay community or the queer community. With black men, it was just super predators. That's all I know. That they were born criminals, criminalized. There was no complexity. It was actually really simple in its violence, right? they're criminals. Like
Well, I
that.
guess in that case, I could be wrong. I'm gonna take a shot at just trying to. I think with the idea, right? Because it's not lived, it's not real of whiteness, right? The idea and whoever aligns themselves as close to this whiteness and that model, like male, heterosexual. I would guess that the biggest argument would be based somehow in religion
Yeah.
against what would be the people would be the white gay people, because everybody else is invisible already. That's what I'm thinking, because
Right.
so any white gay person is the poster child of all the struggle at this moment, and their first deviance is being gay, because if we check privileges, everything else checks out.
I think
So I guess it would be on Christian, the dominance of Christianity being used as an oppressive institution. That would be the one thing, because everybody else is essentially invisible. Black gay people would be
Yes.
further marginalized, and you get. So I think it's just if you're white and you're gay, you are just wow. How could you do that?
And that's interesting because one of the criticisms of Harvey Milk, who was the first publicly out person who was elected, was that, and even in the movie, there is no reckoning with the racial question, even in the film.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that we need to be in a hall of power, which is in its own sense powerful, but in another sense it's an incomplete story, which I think completely resonates with what you're saying, that like, and for many people who watched the film, it was powerful to see, and also so tragic that the poor man was shot for doing it. At the same time, it wasn't, and it's interesting, and I bring up that movie because Anita Briggs was the villain in the film, who was the representative of the church, who was going around the country saying, this is a fight for family, this is a fight for the nuclear family, like, so I think you're spot on, like, I think yeah.
Last comment?
Sorry.
Go.
Okay, good. Well, I like that you brought up religion, because when you were telling us about your project, I was thinking about, I don't know what film you watched, but clips that I've seen of ACT UP lying on the floors of churches and screaming, which is like not convincing an argument, but it's asserting, right? And like laying as a dead body. Like, I don't know, there was just something about that imagery when you talk about grievance and loss that I think is like really compelling. And so I was also wondering, maybe talk about it later, like what were the moments in the film that particularly moving to you, and like those images? And then I just wanted to echo that I think the real world idea is a really interesting project, in part because of the way you were talking about representation and like what space is there to make yourself seen, but like real world was like the first reality TV, and so it's like bringing on all these questions like what's real, what's not, what's television, what's not, and like how is like queerness sort of like carving out space there. It seems really exciting. And then for both of you, I don't know, I thought about this piece that I read by Jarvis Gibbons. I wonder if you read it too. I think it's called There Would Be No Schooling If There Hadn't Been Lynching, but I can even send you a copy of it. But it's a really great piece because he looks at Carter G. Woodson's Creation of Negro History Week and interviews people who were teaching during that time to talk about a Black aesthetic pedagogy. But it's a cool piece just in terms of like structure, the way that you're talking about, which is there's some exegesis, there's storytelling, and then there's like the creation of like that kind of an articulation of a new aesthetic, and I think it's a really compelling sort of like foil to think about structure.
I'm going to call time, but I want to offer just one caveat to all this. This felt like a pretty safe place to invite these two folks to talk about these things. It's not always safe.
Great, yeah.
And when we're talking about various forms of oppression and imprisonment, there's pain. Now, there's not only pain. Remember, and obviously Abdul, who, feels like a saint, he captured what Alice Walker talks about in The Secret of Joy. Resistance is the secret of joy, but resistance not in a negative, but in a, like he's going to capture his own life. They're not going to take it from him, kind of thing. But when you do this kind of work, when it's around oppression, awareness of pain, respect for pain, without getting caught in it. You know, without letting it define the experience, because that's not all there is to anybody's experience. But I just wanted to add that as a caveat, because these are, yeah.
Thank you.
It's not always easy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. It was fun
Great.
That was rich.
to talk. You know, I think you have a lot going on.
Yeah, of course.
It's a lot worth taking in for sure. Okay.
Thank you.
That's right, that's right. And by the way, you already know this, but she should be reaching out to everybody in this room, and you should be reaching out to each other. You need, you need interlocutors, you need, and the other little thing that nobody tells you is that you can ask all kinds of people here to be part of panels that you're putting together or whatever it is, even if you barely know them. If it's somebody that you know, that is working in something that you're, you know, it's relevant. The stunning thing is they will very often say yes. So don't hesitate to, you know, reach out and ask people to be involved in what you're doing. Okay. Good night.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a time.
That was special.
You can turn it.
That was
She was teaching